Hello, I'm Maciej Mikos. You're watching World Today. As the war in Ukraine has entered its another phase, sanctions are being imposed on Russia and more heavy artillery is being prepared to be shipped to the war zone. Russia answers with angry rhetorics and countermeasures concerning the supply of gas to Western Europe. Where does Germany position itself in the conflict, and is Berlin rightly criticized for its reluctance to help Ukraine? To discuss these issues, we are joined by Professor David Engels from the Institute for Western Affairs. Good evening.
Good evening. Thank you for the invitation.
Thank you for accepting it. Now, Germany, along with all the EU member states, agreed on the sixth, it's already the sixth package of sanctions to be imposed on Russia. So has much changed since the beginning of war in Ukraine? Because we remember that Chancellor Scholz declared then that the German economy is just too dependent on Russian fossil fuels to resign from them anytime soon.
Indeed, we see a very slow change, of course. From one package to the next, we see a tightening of sanctions. But very obviously, Germany, but also France, seem to be not really motivated in imposing very tough sanctions. There are, of course, a certain evolution, but I fear that this evolution is essentially rhetoric. It is based, of course, on the horrible images we see every day from Ukraine, but it is also based, I think, on a certain inner German media pressure, because the German media are largely dominated by the Greens party. And so, as we know, the Greens in Germany are very strongly for protective measures for Ukraine. And so these media outlets, of course, push also Chancellor Scholz more and more into a, let's say, critical attitude towards Russia and a tightening of the sanctions. There's another reason also for this, at least rhetorical tightening of sanctions, and that is the problem that many highly exposed people from the Social Democratic Party, that is Scholz's party, are of course very strongly embedded in quite a lot of scandals around the financing of foundations in Germany, also from Russia, from Gazprom, if you think about
the former Chancellor.
Yeah, absolutely. So, for example, the construction of Nord Stream 2 was also largely pushed by money from Gazprom that was versed to a foundation presided by the Minister President of a German land from the SPD. And we know, of course, also how Schröder is linked to Gazprom. So the Social Democrats in Germany are very strongly linked to this Russian complex. And that is too something that the people are more and more realizing by now, and that pushes also Scholz a bit more into the direction of tightening sanctions.
Right. You said it has a lot to do with rhetorics. Now, talking about words and actions, now is Germany trying to regain its position in the EU, which, well, it was partly lost during the last 3 months because of Berlin's indecisiveness in the conflict?
There's certainly also an aspect of wanting to showing presence, of course, within the European structures. But still, I do not see this leadership. I rather see that Europe is profoundly divided into those wanting absolutely to fight Russia by all costs in order to liberate Ukraine, and that is, of course, the eastern periphery of Europe, going down from Sweden and Finland through the Baltic states and Poland down to the Black Sea. And then we have the core nations such as France, such as Germany, who at least rhetorically want to present itself as champion of this endeavor, but are not really present. I was just in Paris some days ago. I saw that everywhere you have Ukrainian flags, for example, but there is not very much behind. And if you think about, for example, President Macron, who more or less on the same day in an official speech said that the defense of Ukraine is a defense of democracy, that the Ukraine need to defend it by all costs, finally by the other European nation. And then you learn that secretly he had this phone call with President Zelensky urging him to offer at least some Ukrainian territories to Putin in order to end this war. This is not what really honest leadership should look like in Europe.
Right, so just empty gestures. Now, as we're discussing sanctions, do you believe that the latest, the sixth package is the right package, is the thing that can actually stop Putin from killing Ukrainians?
No, certainly not. It's another step in the right direction, but these sanctions have only their effect when they include many, if not most, nations on this globalized earth. And of course, Russia is able to continue to doing its deals with China, is strongly developing also the Indian market. So all this is rather shifting Russian activities from its western border to other nations. So it is certainly disturbing Putin, but it is not enough to stop a war. That is certain. I think that everyone implied also and involved in this issue knows it. Even more so as, of course, the huge deals that exist between Russia and China can enable Russia to sell a lot of things to China, which then afterwards are sold by China again to the Western nations also. So these sanctions are leaking, of course.
So let's listen now to German Chancellor Olaf Scholz talking about the sanctions.
Ist einvernehmlich vereinbart worden.
This six-sanction package has been unanimously agreed. We have agreed on an embargo on Russian oil, which will now make a further contribution to Russia paying for its actions with consequences that are significant for Russia's economic development, opportunities and prosperity. The sanctions have a clear objective: to get Russia to end this war and withdraw its troops and to come to an agreement with Ukraine on a reasonable and fair peace.
Sich mit der Ukraine über einen vernünftigen und fairen Frieden zu verständigen.
So to quote Chancellor Scholz, to come to an agreement with Ukraine on a reasonable and fair peace. So what is this reasonable and fair peace, according to Chancellor Scholz?
Yes, that is obviously left very vague, and it is intended as such. Of course, Scholz learned a lot from Chancellor Merkel, who also developed a rather non-committal attitude to most questions. Even of the highest importance as a means of strategy, not involving, not committing your own party, your own interest, makes it of course possible to remain unengaged until the last second. So that is something that Scholz is very obviously also developing. And so this somewhat critical attitude and uncertain wording about fair and of course also feasible and reasonable, that can mean everything. That can mean everything from a total annexation of parts of Ukraine up to all your Russian troops leaving
Ukraine. Exactly, because the question here is fair to whom? Yeah. And it's partly, I think, the statement was partly talking about fair and reasonable peace for Russia, mainly, not for Ukraine. That's the feeling I get.
Absolutely. The word fairness also suggests that there is something like a fair play possible between two players who both have their interest, and we need to understand what Russia wants, what Ukraine wants, in order to settle something in between. That, of course, pushes absolutely aside the fact that we are confronted with a war of aggression of one nation against the other, and that a fair peace cannot somehow sanction this Russian aggression. Because if it does, and there is a possibility that it will, then of course we are again open for war in Europe. Then it is a clear sign also to China that it is possible through military aggression to get territories or to get things you want through conquest instead of through mediation and international arbitration.
Right. Now there's also another interesting aspect. The German Chancellor avoids using such terms as Ukraine winning, Ukraine losing, or Russia winning or losing. Why do you think so?
Well, I think that goes very clearly into the same direction. The Germans do not want necessarily to be too involved in this war. They want to keep out of it. They want to keep all possibilities open because they are thinking mainly about what is after this war. And they very obviously see that their main interest is in resuming good economic relationships with Russia because they are depending on Russia for many goods like energy. I think we will talk about about energy somewhat later. So there is a clear dependency on Russia. And also growingly, there's this interest in developing the reconstruction of Ukraine. That is becoming also increasingly an interesting market also for Germans. Think only about the huge presence of German and French capital here in Poland.
Are you saying that despite all that has been said, Germany is still trying to get to business as usual with Russia?
I think that is, on the long term, certainly the aim. I mean, you can see everywhere, be it on the left, be it on the right, arguments like peace in Europe can only be assured through involving Russia. So there's this rhetoric from the beginning on of trying to involve and to pacify Russia. And I think that is strongly behind that. And many people also in Germany, I think, do not feel really committed to this war. For them, it is very far away, and also there is the effect, of course, of many decades of working on their own history, and so being involved again in territories of battle, in battle zones where the German Wehrmacht was also involved. That is, of course, for many Germans a huge trauma and a huge no-go. That also explains that for them they want this war over, whatever the results
the outcome,
may be.
right?
Yeah.
I understand. So, as we discussed already, the German-Russian relations. What about German-Ukrainian relations? How would you describe them?
Well, for the moment, they are, of course, very strongly affected by the, let's say, the problems around the Ambassador Melnik in Berlin. Melnik has played a very present role in many talk shows, in many interviews. So he really tries to give voice to the need of the Ukrainian people, and they want they wish to win this war, at least to push the Russians outside. And he does this in no uncertain terms. So he's criticizing very openly this discrepancy between a moralizing rhetoric on the one side from the Germans and their obvious lack in delivering heavy weaponry to Ukraine. So he says that very openly, and so he has become something of the black sheep in the German media and the German public, with many people even wanting just to send him away, replace him by another ambassador. So that shows, of course, also that relations are quite tense. Of course,
that would be a huge mistake. You agree?
That would be certainly a huge mistake, but still, even today on Welt TV, Melnik was confronted with this question that Ukraine was changing some of its ambassadors, I think, in Georgia and other countries, and so he was also confronted with, will he then be also exchanged for another ambassador? So that is something that seems to be quite interesting to Germany, because once again, Germany doesn't want this war, and they want it not to affect them too obviously. And
so is this the reason why German Chancellor and President are reluctant to go to Kiev?
Well, that is certainly an aspect. I don't think they are reluctant. They wanted to go to Kiev, as we know, and it seemed to have been Zelensky and Kiev who didn't want to receive at the same time.
If I'm not mistaken, Olaf Scholz stated that he doesn't want to go there just for a family photo.
Yes, afterwards. But at the beginning, he wanted, of course, to accompany President Duda and the presidents also of the Baltic states to Ukraine. There was also this issue about the President Steinmeier also,
yes,
who was involved, who had to go to Ukraine, and who was signified that he wasn't really welcome by Zelensky. And of course, Scholz doesn't want also to become involved in this imbroglio and be confronted also with a rejection. So he waits before being publicly invited, because once again, large parts also of the Germans also united around President Steinmeier at that moment and thought that this was a proof also of ungratitude by the part of the Ukrainians, and that a nation that didn't even want to receive their president was also not necessarily ideal as being helped also by.
It was the expression of gratitude towards Steinmeier's former actions.
Exactly.
Right. Now I'd like us to listen to German Economy Minister Robert Habeck.
Alle, ich auch als Minister jeweils.
Everybody of us as ministers. I mean, the German oath of office is to devote power and welfare to the German people, and I assume the Hungarians and other countries will have sworn a similar oath. Still, there is a confusion between short-term look at one's own country and a long-term observation of principles, which can only be enshrined globally. And I am irritated, and that's a polite way of saying it, how this confusion could take such deep hold in the case of Viktor Orban, that one pokers ruthlessly for just their own interests. My assessment of the Ukrainian crisis, or of the attack of Russia on Ukraine, is still that Putin won't stop if he doesn't lose in Ukraine.
Angriff von Russland auf die Ukraine ist noch immer die.
So to quote, I am irritated that that's a polite way of saying it, how this confusion could take such deep hold in the case of Viktor Orban that one pokers ruthlessly for just their own interests. Now, Germany has been criticized for a long time for its indecisiveness and, juggling, what's good and bad for their own. So is this somehow an effort to try to take responsibility off the German shoulders and put it on Viktor Orban's Hungary?
Yes, very obviously. That's also what we see in the German news. Even today also there was a huge debate on that Hungary is becoming the bad boy of the European Union for not permitting a larger sixth sanction pact. Nevertheless, we see, of course, that these sanctions until now, and thanks to Germany, of course, try to avoid implying gas delivery from Russia to Europe, because Germany, once again, is dependent on gas, probably as much or at least in similar terms than Hungary is depending also on Russian oil. And so it is very practical, of course, for Germany to push this responsibility on Viktor Orban. Of course, I wouldn't want now to excuse Orban. Of course, his attitude toward Russia has for many years been characterized by some form of ambiguity and Machiavellian wish to juggle with as many balls as possible, big China, Russia, the European Union, in order to survive as a small nation also against Brussels. So there is this ambiguity. But it is obvious, and it is strange also to see that the German medias have largely ceased to speak about the gas imports from Russia in order to focus only on oil and only, of course, on Hungary's responsibility for cancelling these measures.
Well, the strategy obviously didn't work on Russia, as it has decided to cut some of German, Dutch and Danish companies off the gas supplies. Now, how will it affect the German economy?
Well, that's difficult to say, of course, as we are lacking now concrete data on the long-term evolution, and as also the gas reserves are also still there. They are not entirely full, of course, in Germany, but there is still some margin to survive for some months with what they have in order to clarify this situation. But on the long run, of course, there is a huge dependency of Germany from Russian gas. I think it's more or less half of the gas imports also to Germany come from Russia, and this dependency is something that is a legacy of Angela Merkel. Angela Merkel, who wanted to, with a typical strategy of the asymmetrical mobilization or asymmetrical demobilization, wanted to include the policy of the Greens into her own actions as a chancellor in order not to let grow any form of opposition to the CDU. That is why she decided very quickly after Fukushima to go out of nuclear energy and other measures. And so somehow, well, if you go out of nuclear, if you go out of coal energy, then you need to have some supplies for energy. And as the renewable energies are not at all large and performant enough, they had to settle on Russian gas. And so Russian gas is somehow the energy source that permits Germany still having some form of stability in its electrical power grid. And so,
obviously, energy can be used as a weapon. That's obvious. But now I'd like us to talk about weapons per se. Now, Germany has been criticized for its reluctance to send some heavy weaponry to Ukraine. So do you think it is in fact not supporting Ukraine as much as it could and should, or is just as the German officials describe it, that the military storage facilities are almost empty now.
Well, that is certainly an aspect too. We know already for many years that the situation of the German Bundeswehr is absolutely catastrophical. As for many years, there have been huge cuttings also in the army. So the result is, of course, not pleasant at all. So there isn't much to be delivered on the one hand. On the other hand, there's this wish also not to antagonize Putin too much. And then finally, there is this psychological aspect. Germany's identity since 1945 is based on this idea, no more war, we want peace. And so Germany doesn't want to be involved in any form of military action worldwide, basically. And that is something of a reason of state for Germany, so
right,
until now.
You said not to antagonize Putin. What about antagonizing Poland? You know, there is a dispute between Poland and Germany because apparently Germany declared that it will deliver some tanks to Poland if Poland gives away its tanks to Ukraine. Now, there are no German tanks in Poland. Do you think there will be?
No. Well, or perhaps very late and probably tanks without much utility, or at least not the right number. But we see from the beginning on an avoidance by Scholz to be committed. At the beginning, we heard about 5,000 helmets. Then they were speaking about some rocket launchers from the ancient DDR, which didn't really work. Then we spoke about some tanks, but without any form of ammunition.
Right.
Now there is this idea of the Ringtausch, of delivering some German weapons to Poland in exchange for Poland sending theirs, and then finally it is not honored as a promise. So from one step to the next, we have this avoidance to sending weapons, but it is at least in the German media not verbalized as much as it should. I'm listening quite a lot to German media in these last weeks, and it is astonishing that the Germans never seem to speak about the Polish commitment. So you have for hours and hours people on the media talking about the huge German involvement in this war, Germany sending money, Germany taking over refugees, Germany sending not less armament than Denmark, the Netherlands, France, or all other European nations, and Poland is simply not mentioned. So most of the German people have no idea about what Poland, for example, is really sending to Ukraine.
It's quite shocking.
And that obviously Poland can send hundreds of tanks to Ukraine without this resulting in an immediate war declaration by Russia. So Germany still thinks in large parts that sending just one tank to Ukraine could trigger the Third World War, which must be avoided at all costs. That is more or less the official reasoning for the moment.
There's only one person who can decide on the Third World War, and he does not reside in Germany. He resides in Moscow. Yeah. Professor David Engels from the Institute for Western Affairs was our guest this evening. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for the invitation.
And that would be all for now. Thank you for watching, but don't go away as we have a Military Mind coming up next.